So today I wanted to give you my take on why people make conspiracy theories and why people believe conspiracy theories. I'm going to do this in two parts. The first part is the believer. Why do people believe in the theories? Second part is the conspiracy theorist. Why do people make up and proliferate conspiracy theories? So let's start with the conspiracy believer. Now, the first thing to understand that what the conspiracy theorist does, he or she taps into pre-existing preconceptions and prejudices of the conspiracy theory believer. A conspiracy theorist cannot convince somebody without their permission, so they definitely play a role in it. They're not passive in this. It's something that it's a feeling that they have, but the conspiracy theorist just puts words and articulates well what they feel inside them. And this can be due to a variety of factors, a variety of causes that causes this. But the conspiracy theorist consolidates that and brings it into something they can articulate, something that can easily be explained. It gives an outlet for whatever feeling, usually negative feeling they have of grief, trauma, rage. Typically, something's gone wrong in the conspiracy believer's life, and this gives an outlet for that anger, that rage. Now, if something's gone wrong in your life, it creates a feeling that you're not in control of things, that events are happening to you, there's nothing you can do about it. And the theory just creates a cause for this. This bad thing happened, and to believe that there's, puppet masters up there controlling events, it's an easy explanation for what explains something away which is actually far more scary, that life is random and life is just unfair. There's also something within all of us that conspiracy theorists have a heightened sense of. It's something called illusory pattern perception. And what this is just something we all have. We all notice patterns. It's something we do to survive. We try to predict events. Like if we see something rustling in the bushes, we that might be a snake. So we perceive patterns. Now, the people who are vulnerable to believe conspiracy theories, they have a heightened sense of this. I mean, we all have this pattern perception, but they have more of it. And it leads them to, especially if they've experienced some negative event in their life, it leads them to be susceptible to these conspiracy theories, where in fact what they're actually looking at is just random stimuli. They perceive patterns in random things. Now let me give an example of this. If we look at this picture here, I think what most people would notice first is a triangle. So we use our pattern perceptions to say, there's a triangle. Now, if you look closely, there's no actual triangle there. It's just looking at the other images that we can see, and we perceive a triangle. Now, you might even notice that the triangle looks like a different shade of color. It looks more white than the background. But if you look closely, there's no actual change of shade in the white. But because we have this pattern perception, we perceive that to be more white than the background. So we all have this, but certain people will connect things that ought not to be connected. They'll make weak analogies. It's skewed by their innermost motivations and desires. Moreover, conspiracy theories, we all have to admit, they're very entertaining. It's something that makes us feel good just because they entertain us. It's an additional factor that makes some people more vulnerable to believe these conspiracy theories. You might have noticed that you may know someone who believes in not only one conspiracy theory. These kind of people tend to believe more than one conspiracy theories. They even believe conspiracy theories that contradict each other. But that flaw in logic, that flaw in reasoning doesn't affect them, because it's not really about that. It's about how the conspiracy theory makes them feel inside. It's just something that helps them regulate their state of mind. So once a conspiracy theory has been established, what really reinforces that is if they find another person who also believes in the same conspiracy theory. That creates conspiracy theory bubbles, and then eventually it's a sense of community, that a group of people will come together. They'll make each other feel good by reinforcing the conspiracy theory. At the same time, it makes the perceived validity of the conspiracy theory stronger and long-lasting. There is also a correlation with education levels. If you have not been to college, if you have a lower level of educational attainment, that also tends to make you more vulnerable to conspiracy theories. There's a certain areas of logic. We look at logic, or we look at logical fallacies, for example, where if you apply those to the conspiracy theory, that can pretty easily debunk that conspiracy theory. But if you haven't had that formal education, you're less likely to be able to use these intellectual tools to debunk the theory. Now, I should say that when I talk about education, I'm not talking about intelligence. Oftentimes, the conspiracy theory is someone who is intelligent, but who has not had the advantages of a more formal education. Let's move on from the conspiracy theory believer, because that's one part of the equation. We also have the conspiracy theorist. He's an individual that will articulate, navigate, and develop this conspiracy theory. He will lead the story on exactly what is happening, why it is happening, why they believe it's true. Now, this person is a completely different kind of person. I mean, of course, there's many kinds, but let me talk about the worst kind of conspiracy theorist. The worst kind, I think, actually knows deep down that the conspiracy theory is a lie. They're not really interested in the theory as such. These people are some of the worst people you could meet. These people are nihilists. And what I mean by that in this particular case, they don't really care the effect of their words and their stories have on people. It's all just about them. These people are also highly narcissistic, and as it pertains to the conspiracy theory, the main driver of why they are proliferating this conspiracy theory is simply in order to receive something called narcissistic supply. Narcissistic supply is simply just the kind of attention they get for proliferating this theory. It's a particularly pernicious kind of attention. So the narcissist, it doesn't really matter whether that's a positive attention or negative attention. I mean, I think they would probably prefer the positive attention, but the negative attention is something they also enjoy. So they get that not only from the people who believe their conspiracy theories, they also get it from the people who debunk the conspiracy theory. They really enjoy the position they are in. Now, in order to prove my point, in particular to prove what they're doing is deliberate, I've taken two conspiracy theories. So let's look at the first conspiracy theorist. This is a guy, most of you probably know, David Irving. He's a Holocaust denier. Now, I want to show you the first clip. This is just to establish that they're not just jumping into the theory, they're laying the groundwork.
We now come to the major gap in our wartime history, which is the gap in our knowledge on the Holocaust. And here I'm bound to say that I'm not one of those people who says the Holocaust didn't happen, although I'm not going to try and define what the Holocaust was. Undoubtedly, the Germans and others in World War II inflicted major massacres on the Jews in various parts of Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And this has to be said.
Please listen to this, because it'll stop you from shooting your mouth off and overreaching. There's a lot in the Holocaust story that is fake. A lot of the numbers are fake, like the one I told you about in Riga, where you do the math. But a lot of the ugly part of the story is true.
So you can see from that clip, he's establishing credibility. He's saying, well, I'm not really a Holocaust denier. I'm not saying nothing happened. I'm just questioning things. Can't we, have a discussion about the numbers and exactly how it happened? So he's establishing credibility with his audience. And remember that what he's doing, as I stated before, he is tapping into the pre-existing prejudices of people who kind of inclined to believe that before they encountered David Irving. He's giving them that outlet. He's giving that verification of what they think, well, not think, what they already kind of feel to be true. And he's doing it in a way that seems credible and reasonable. It establishes trust with their conspiracy theory. Now he continues in this vein.
She brought back a copy of a photograph of Belsen showing a bulldozer pushing bodies into a pit. And I said, Jessica, have a look at that photograph again. It's a British soldier driving a British Army bulldozer. It's after the war, and they're pushing the bodies into a pit for reasons of hygiene. These are typhus victims. The bodies are all emaciated and hideously malformed because of the diseases that have been inflicted on them in the last weeks of the war. And who was responsible for the malnutrition and the diseases in Bergen-Belsen? Might it perhaps have been the people who carried out the saturation bombing of the pharmaceutical factories and the transportation networks, namely the British Air Force and the Americans? Are we not at least equally guilty and to blame for the malnutrition and the horrors that we found when we entered the camp? The whole of Germany was starving at that time. It wasn't just the people in Belsen who were the Belsen children with the rib cages showing. It was the whole of Germany was suffering because of the bombing campaign, which was deliberately designed to destroy the transportation network, and so the food supplies collapsed. that out there are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of ordinary people who are beginning to come off the fence on our side. People who know what they're talking about. And they're coming off the fence on our side because they've seen others doing it before them. Tales of the appalling atrocities that did happen, the massacres, the shooting, the machine gunning. We've seen pictures of them. But the biggest problem for the historian now is to overcome the propaganda. And if I tell you a shocking series of documents that's in the British archives, which has never been published anywhere, you'll begin to understand what the problem is. In 1942, the British government's psychological warfare executive, which was our branch of propaganda warfare, decided deliberately to start the lie that the Nazis had gas chambers for killing Jews.
So you can see here he's introduced the conspiracy theory. He's made a claim which is essentially something unfalsifiable. That means that, at least in his point of view, it cannot be proved one way or the other. So if he says it, it's up to people to provide empirical evidence that it's not true. What he's trying to establish is, oh, they can't prove it's not true. Bearing in mind, most of his audience, the people he's speaking to, are susceptible to this. They wouldn't be familiar with something called the burden of proof fallacy. They would say, well, they can't prove it's not true, and I feel that it's true. So therefore, the evidence weighs on my side that this must be true. Once he's established a claim, he'll now present supporting evidence of what he claims to be true.
Last here, that I am right and that the legend is dying is a man who none of us had ever heard of. I'm sure in this entire room nobody had ever heard of an Austrian engineer called Lüftel. He isn't just any engineer, he turns out to be the president of the Austrian Chamber of Engineers. First I knew about him was when I read in the Süddeutsche Zeitung and in the Frankfurter Zeitung and in all the German newspapers a news item this size announcing that Mr. Lüftel, the chief engineer, the head of the Austrian Chamber of Engineers, had been obliged to resign because he had written an affidavit or some kind of legal statement or opinion. He'd written an opinion saying that in his opinion, and you can't call it an unqualified opinion because he's the head of the Chamber of Engineers. I mean, the Jews thought they had luck with Fred Leuchter because it turned out he wasn't a registered engineer, so they got him on that. But this is a guy who is a registered engineer. He's not only a registered engineer, he's the head of the Austrian Chamber of Engineers. And he has been quietly sitting down on his backside for the last 2 or 3 years thinking for himself, like a lot of intelligent people around the world. And he's announced in a newspaper opinion, he's announced in a legal opinion for a court case, that in his opinion, as an engineer, the gas chambers were technologically totally impossible. They're technically impossible. They couldn't have operated. They couldn't have functioned. In no way that they could have functioned. From a simple engineering viewpoint, all the parameters, the heat, the size, the quantity, the speed, the volume, that nothing would have worked. And because of that, he said, in my view as a qualified engineer, the whole thing is a legend.
So the first part of trying to deny the Holocaust is saying, well, there were no gas chambers. And he's not just saying, well, I'm not saying it because I think it's true. Look at this. We have some evidence, an engineer. Now, if you say the word engineer, you have these connotations of someone who has been to university, who's studied, who's scientific, who's learned, and he can speak on some authority. Now, the engineer, it's an individual by the name of Walter Lüftel. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name, Walter Lüftel. He himself is a conspiracy theory believer. So he, like most conspiracy theory believers, he not only believes in this conspiracy, he believes in other conspiracies. He believed that climate change was a conspiracy. He believes that foot and mouth disease was also a conspiracy. But here he's presented by David Irving as someone who's credible. His audience, that's the first thing they're ever going to hear about this Walter Lüftel character. Now he continues, so the next piece of quote-unquote evidence that he presents is something called the Leitcher report.
To me that you could test a gas chamber in a laboratory, that you could go to these buildings that are on these photographs and look out the gas chambers which are identified by all the people who say that there were gas chambers at Auschwitz, and you could bring back the bits of the inside, actual samples. And Zündel's men did that almost sacrilegiously, trampling across a burial ground almost, with a hammer and chisel, knocking away at the inside of the gas chambers, bringing back 20 pounds of the fragments of mortar and cement and concrete, which were then subjected to a commercial laboratory, a forensic laboratory for analysis in the United States. And what he had wanted to introduce at his trial, but the judge refused, quite rightly, because he had by now ruled that the Holocaust happened, he took judicial notice of it. What Zundel introduced at his trial were the laboratory reports showing, on the one hand, that there was not the slightest trace of any cyanide compound in the fabric of those gas chambers where it should have been, while on the other hand, in the disinfectation chambers at Auschwitz, still there in the ruins, these little buildings where clothing had been taken off the prisoners and subjected to delousing processes by cyanide gas to kill the lice and the vermin and the prisoners and the soldiers' clothing, in those walls there was 1,000 milligrams of cyanide per kilogram. So the believers, put it like that, the people who still believe in Auschwitz and Treblinka and Majdanek as death factories have got to explain to me, as an educated, intelligent person who knows a bit about chemistry, it's an exact science, believe me, it's not a subjective science you can debate, it's an exact science. They have got to explain to me how it's possible for these gas chambers to have not the slightest trace of any toxic substance left in the mortar and the masonry and the walls. It's not possible. It's an insurmountable fact.
I was required to give evidence as an expert witness in the Ernst Zundel trial. And so for that reason I read the whole of the Fred Leuchter reports. And attached to the Fred Leuchter reports was the forensic laboratory tables on the buildings that Fred Leuchter collected samples from. And the forensic laboratory found no significant trace of cyanide compounds. And that is what got me very interested, shall we say, because I went to university, I studied chemistry, and I know it's an exact science, and if there's no significant trace of cyanide in the walls of the gas chambers, so-called, then there has to be an explanation for it. They've got the wrong buildings.
So again, he's building on these credible claims. And remember that with this character, David Irving, it's not just in these clips that he claims this. He's said this over and over again. Fred Leuchter was an individual. He's also a conspiracy theory believer, an anti-Semite. He went to Auschwitz and without anyone's permission, he did chemical tests on the purported gas chambers. So he went into Auschwitz, he drilled into the concrete on the wall, and he did a chemical test to determine whether there were any toxins in the wall. And lo and behold, he said, oh, well, we couldn't find any toxins within the walls. Therefore, this was not a gas chamber. Therefore, nobody was gassed. This has since been debunked. You know, of course, he didn't drill very far into it. If you drill further into the concrete, you would find those chemicals that derive from the Cyclone B that was used to gas the Holocaust victims. He didn't do it. He just presented this selective, cherry-picked evidence. So there's further purported evidence that there was no gas chambers and there was no Cyclone B, that simply didn't happen. So we have this kind of pseudo-scientific evidence for the fact there was no gas chambers. But another weakness of that claim is the witnesses. I mean, you know, tens of thousands of people came back and said, look, this happened. I saw it with my own eyes. So now, how does David Irving tend to deny that all these people are lying? Well, take a look.
Interview people, and they become very indignant when I had to point out to them they weren't there. They weren't in the center of the stage giving the orders. They were miles away, and they read about it years later, and after a time they really believed themselves to have been there. And it's not an ugly human trait, it's human nature. You believe you were there because you recall it so vividly. And the Jews are an impressionable people, and it is part of the Jewish tragedy that they believe they were there. And they're rather ashamed that they weren't there. They're happy that people do believe they were there. I'm not... It came as an echo of our own propaganda. And then people come to me and they say, Mr. Irving, what about the eyewitnesses who were there? My answer to that is there's two logical questions. If Adolf Hitler's main aim in life was, as we are now told, to exterminate as many Jews as possible, these survivors were in the jaws of death. They were in Auschwitz, and they survived, and I'm glad. As many survivors there are, the more there are, the more glad I am. But they themselves are living testimony to the fact that there was therefore no Nazi plan of extermination, because there are now hundreds of thousands of survivors with their tattoos demonstrating outside this hotel tonight and causing trouble, and they are the living testimony that there was no dedicated Nazi, ruthlessly efficient policy of extermination. And if I am then told, what about the ones who actually saw things happening, I must admit this is a problem. I can only explain it on psychological grounds. Having spent 25 years as a writer doing research, the numbers of rather tragic times I've met people who have been on the periphery of a great event, and over the years have convinced themselves they were at the center of a great event. They want to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral almost. And these people, the tragic people who suffered the appalling brutality of Auschwitz and Treblinka and Majdanek, they believe after a time that they saw the gas chambers, that they saw the executions. all their stories are different. And none of their stories tally with the photographs that we have of Auschwitz now, the magnificent British aerial photographs that were taken in 1944.
So now you can see that from slowly, and remember I've presented these clips fairly quickly, but he does this over a very long period of time, establishing pseudoscientific evidence. Now he's primed his audience to believe something ridiculous, something absurd, that all these people are just lying. Now, of course, that sounds ridiculous, but once you've tapped into an audience, once you've tapped into their pre-existing prejudices, they're now ready to believe the absurd and ridiculous part of the conspiracy theory. In addition to the narcissistic supply that these characters get from proliferating these conspiracy theories, there's also something called duper's delight. These kind of narcissistic people, they enjoy deceiving people. Once they've succeeded in making people believe something absurd, that gives them a sense of power, a sense of pleasure from doing that. Now, it's not just David Irving. There's various different kind of these really worst of the worst kind of conspiracy theorists. They will employ the same techniques. Let's take another conspiracy theorist. Let's look at David Icke.
I always feel that authority should command respect by its actions, not demand it just because it's authority. But that seems to be the way things happen and the way things work. When you're challenging normality, then that which has accepted normality to be the real world is going to see you as crazy.
He's saying, well, I'm not really a conspiracy theorist. I'm just, this is just healthy skepticism. Why shouldn't we question those in power? So it seems reasonable on the face of it. And again, he doesn't rush into the absurd. He's slowly establishing credibility with his audience. And again, like David Irving, he calmly introduces the conspiracy theory.
This global conspiracy that I've been exposing for 3 decades is basically the hijacking of human perception. And all this getting the population, especially the young, or be the adults then, addicted to technology is all about the here, kitty, 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 preparing people to accept this. So you've got that agenda at the end of this road of the human mind as we know it being replaced by artificial intelligence. But out of the same, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, out of the same devil's playground, Silicon Valley, is coming the Google, Facebook, etc., algorithmic censorship, more and more, of the alternative media.
So yeah, you see this step by step. It's not until about 30 minutes into this video that I'm showing you here that he starts introducing the absurd.
Non-human entities, that many taking a reptilian form, becomes far less fantastic than if you're coming from postage stamp consensus, which is waving it away by reflex action load of rubbish. You know, people who've been in mind control projects, people who've been in government projects, who've interacted with these entities in underground bases. And they're describing what the ancients described. When you've got this man who's unfortunately just died in his 90s, William Tompkins, writing a book in 2015, describing how he was seconded in 1942 into a top secret naval intelligence operation in America based at the naval base at San Diego, where his role, or the role of that organization, was to interact with non-human entities. And he produces documents, he produces pictures of people he was with to support what he claims. Bloodlines were created that are hybrids, part reptilian, not always reptilian, but part reptilian, part human, which is the origin of the royal aristocratic bloodline whole order of the ages. You know, the ancient Chinese emperors used to claim the right to be emperor because of their descendants from the serpent gods.
And here we go, there it is, that people are part reptilians. Now this reptilian story, this is something that David Icke has been proliferating for a long time, and he's also received a lot of criticism. People have, obviously and clearly debunked this obvious claim. So now what he's doing, he's playing it down a bit, or he's being subtle about it. He's just saying, well, I mean, look, we have these people in power. You don't know how they got their power. You don't know what they do behind closed doors. Maybe they are part lizard. So yeah, that's the point of view of the conspiracy theorist. These people are very malignant, malicious people. They don't care the damage that they do to people. They literally destroy people's lives. And they wouldn't think about that for a second. But once the conspiracy theorist has established a conspiracy theory, they also establish a community of people that come together, that people who, for whatever reason, for whatever has happened in their lives, they don't feel good about themselves. They don't feel good about where they are in the world. And when they come together, they can feel good. There's an explanation for the bad things that are happening. There's something to grab hold to, something easy, something not too complicated to explain why bad things happen in the world. So that has been my take on why people believe conspiracy theories and why people proliferate conspiracy theories. My name is John Alexander. Thank you very much for watching.